Welcome to Reconciliation Roundtable. I'm Mark Beckwith, the host. I'm the retired bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Newark in New Jersey. I'm also the author of Seeing the Unseen, Beyond Prejudices, Paradigms, and Party Lines. Today with me is Ryan Burge, who is the Associate Professor of Political Science at Eastern Illinois University, author of 4 books, including The Nones, N-O-N-E-S, 20 Myths About Religion and Politics in America, The Great Dechurching. He has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, has appeared on 60 Minutes, where he was identified as the, quote, leading data analyst on religion and politics in the United States. He writes, he podcasts about the strains and stresses in the Christian world today and how some congregations, particularly more conservative ones, are more and more aligned with political policies and positions. Ryan has been a leader, a pastor in the American Baptist Church. How has that journey affected your work?
Well, my last church, I was there for almost 18 years. And before that, I served in another church, and I was a youth pastor for 3 years before that. So I've spent most of my adult life in ministry in the American Baptist Church after growing up Southern Baptist. So I would say it's in and among and through everything I do. I can't kind of put that aside as much as I would like to. It's just part of who I am and how I think about the world. When I do the data stuff, I really try to present the world as the way it exists. But it's also important to know that I'm a person of faith. I think it makes me a better researcher in some ways because I can see Christianity from the inside, how, Christians think about it, how culture impacts it, and how the church has evolved over time. There's a lot of nuance to American Christianity, and I think being someone who grew up in the church helps me understand some nuances that maybe the average researcher wouldn't get about what's going on in the religious landscape in America. Being a pastor for so long and then closing down my church in July has also given me perspective into non-religious Americans and what the struggle is like when you don't really have a place to go, on next Sunday. You got to find a place and start a new community and all that awkwardness that comes with all those things. So I think my faith journey has actually made me a better researcher, a better thinker, and honestly more empathetic to people at every level of the religious spectrum, whether they're very religious or not, because I have gone through that journey myself.
And you've put together lots of graphs and identified trends. What encouragement have you received and what pushback have you experienced?
The encouragement is just the engagement I get. I started out on Twitter. That was my home base for a long time. I've sort of migrated a little bit away from that over time, but getting more followers and getting retweets from, really prominent people in American thought life has always been a really big encouragement for me. I get emails from people on a regular basis saying thank you for the work that you do because no one else is really doing it in the way that you're doing it. I get lots of subscribers on my Substack newsletter. I have almost 14,000 subscribers today, and they get 2 posts a week. The pushback has been interesting because some people call me too liberal and some people call me too conservative. I really try my very best to be an impartial referee. My job is just to call balls and strikes the best way I can, but not perfectly because no one is without bias. I have my own perceptions of life because of my background and experience, but I really try to, to use an old phrase, I try to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable as much as I can with data. There's some data that makes people feel really good about themselves, but then there's some data that should make you feel really bad about yourself and your organization and your tribe. So I think my job is to show you the world the way it exists. The comment I get every once in a while is, I can't figure out what you are or who you play for or what your team is. And my response to that is good. I'm incredibly encouraged by the fact that you don't know if I'm a Republican or a Democrat, right? If I'm a liberal Christian or a conservative Christian, what my theology is on all these things. I'd rather just be as neutral as I possibly can be. And I also just say, I love being in diverse religious spaces. I've spoken at the Southern Baptist Convention, and I've also spoken with the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I just like to be able to navigate between these spaces and be seen as someone who everyone can kind of look to and trust and has integrity. That's my goal.
I have understood that the fastest growing religious group in America now are nones, N-O-N-E-S, and I suppose you can confirm that. What is it about the nones? Say more about that. And also, I have experienced in my own pastoral ministry, there are a growing number of dones, people who are done with their community because of conflict or lack of resources or buildings falling down or some sort of thing. What about nones and dones?
So in 1991, the share of Americans who claimed no religious affiliation was about 5%. So really just a small fraction. And they were really not studied that much amongst the social science set because they were just such a small portion of the American population. But from that point forward, it's just exploded. And now today, the share of Americans who claim no religious affiliation on surveys is closer to 30%. And if you look at the younger generations like millennials and Generation Z, over 40% of them claim no religious affiliation. I think it's the largest social movement, at least in my lifetime, in American religious history. You're seeing a quarter of Americans now go from being religious to being non-religious in just the last 30 years. It's astonishing, and all the impacts it's having on all aspects of American society. So a lot of what my career has been is, first off, writing The Nuns in 2021 was really where things kicked off. But then what that's led to is other opportunities to do more in-depth study of non-religious Americans in ways that traditional surveys don't allow. So Tony Jones and I have a Templeton grant called Making Meaning in a Post-Religious America. And it's really trying to figure out a better way to classify non-religious Americans. And what we found is that there's huge differences. We have one group that we call nuns in name only, N-I-N-O, Ninos, because they look like religious people on all kinds of metrics, except they just don't claim a religious affiliation. But then on the other side of the ledger, you've got about 20% of non-religious people. I call them zealous nuns or evangelical nuns because they hate religion, basically, and they want you to hate it too. They actually try to evangelize people away from a religious tradition. So you got this huge variation. It's hard to quantify. Like, what percentage of nuns are like open to religion, open to spirituality, and what percentage are just like, I hate everything about this, I want nothing to do with this, and I wish it would go away.
Where would you put Abraham Lincoln, who never claimed affiliation with any particular domination, but his writings, his spiritual depth, his wisdom was just amazing? Where would you put him in this spectrum of things?
Well, you couldn't be more providential with this question because I'm actually listening to John Meacham's recent book about Lincoln, which is, it actually gets really into the spiritual side of Lincoln more than other biographies do, which I can really appreciate. And that's actually why I picked it up, because I wanted to hear more of, sort of theology and his life journey, his faith journey. Lincoln actually, I think in many ways is emblematic of how a lot of Americans think about faith, which is they come closer to it than farther away from it. They struggle with this aspect of it, but they embrace that aspect of it. At one point when he was a young man, he wrote an entire pamphlet about why Jesus could not be the Son of God. And one of his mentors took it and threw it in the stove and said, never do that ever again. If you ever want to run for political office in this country, you can't be so bold about these things. But then if you look at Lincoln, let's say during the Civil War, he wrote on this little scrap of paper, Meditation on the Divine Will, which was him trying to figure out how God is working through the Civil War conflict and trying to make sense of God's will and the struggle and the pain that he was going through and the country was going through. So I think his faith is actually very emblematic of a lot of people in that they work in and out of religion over their life course, right? It's not they're always in or they're always out. Some days they're more in, some days they're more out. They struggle with this piece and they struggle with that piece. I honestly think that's probably how most people are when it comes to religion. It's just we don't see it so clearly because we don't study each individual person as well as we've studied a guy like Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah. Have you studied the dones, people who are done with their church? I've met lots of people. I was involved for years. Then my children were confirmed and I left it, or there was conflict in the church. Have you done any research on that?
That Templeton study, we did a survey of about 12,000 non-religious folks. And what we figured out is about 40% of we would classify in the done category. We ask a lot of questions about what your orientation towards religion is. Like, do you think it should be eradicated? Do you think it's a form of child abuse? Could the world be better if religion was never invented? Questions like that to really figure out how they feel. And about 40% of them are pretty much done with religion and would really wish it to go away. But again, of that 40%, they're sort of divided into two camps. We call one of them the zealous nuns, which I just described. They're very evangelistic about their nunness. There's another camp I call like laissez-faire nuns, which are like, I don't like religion. I think it's awful. But if you want to be religious, that's on you. I'm not going to have anything to do with you. I'm not going to try to convince you of that. That also says, though, that about 60% of nuns are open to religion in one way, shape, or form. So most nuns are not duns. There are a lot of duns, but they don't make up the majority of these nuns.
A couple of months ago, I had a conversation with John Danforth, retired senator from Missouri, who's also an Episcopal priest. And he mentioned in America, we invest in politics much more than it deserves. And you have said, and researched that there is a greater alignment with the Republican Party and evangelical churches, so that religion and church, at least in some sectors, there's hardly any space between the two of them. How is that now playing out as we approach this election?
The one thing I really want to make clear is that white religion in America has become conservative. And by the way, what's really important about that is it's not just evangelicals who are becoming more conservative. You're actually seeing even what we call mainline denominations become more conservative, like the United Methodist Church before the split. Obviously, the split's going to mess everything up. But even things like the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America used to be seen as a liberal denomination, but in 2020, most ELCA members voted for Donald Trump. The Episcopal Church is maybe the only example where a majority of white Christians did not vote for Donald Trump in 2020. We're talking from the Southern Baptist Convention down to the American Baptist Church, which is what I'm a member of. We're a mainline denomination. White Christianity in America is increasingly conservative. Amongst white evangelical Christianity, it's even more conservative. So now you're talking about 80% of white evangelical Protestants are going to vote for Donald Trump in 2024 because they voted for him in 2020. But what's interesting about that is they also voted for John McCain in 2008 at that same level and Mitt Romney in 2012 at that same level. So I don't think it's anything specific about Donald Trump. What I think is that for whatever reason, white Christianity in America is being seen as overly conservative and becoming more conservative every single year.
How do you account for that, either in your research or just what you see, what you're learning?
We have this idea called the God gap, which is just the idea that, it used to be that 90+% of Americans were Christians and 95% of Americans were religious people, like back in the 70s and 80s. So what that meant was the Democrats and the Republicans were overwhelmingly religious groups because that's just what America was. But what's happened over time is that the nones have risen, but they've risen asymmetrically when it comes to politics, which means that the nones have risen much more quickly amongst Democrats than amongst Republicans. And so today, what you have is parties that are in completely different places when it comes to religion. Even today, 75% of the Republican Party are white Christians in a country where white Christianity is about 48% of America. They're overwhelmingly Republicans. The Democrats now are 45% non-religious voters. So the way I try to think about it is the Democratic Party now is a party of the nones, largely, but also the party of non-white Christians, so Black Protestants, Hispanic Catholics, Hispanic evangelicals, but also the party of Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and other religious traditions, with a few white Christians kind of smattered in there, about 30%. The Republican Party is basically the party of white Christianity. And I think we've sorted ourselves out over time, where now if you're a young person and you're non-religious, you look around and go, man, the Republican Party doesn't like gay people, doesn't like trans people, doesn't like abortion. I like all those things. Therefore, I need to be a Democrat. And I think what younger people are seeing is they don't see an option for a religious person to be a Democrat anymore or a non-religious person to be a Republican. We've sort of sorted ourselves out politically.
Interesting dynamic. Wow. You've written that it is our job to be faithful to the mission of the church. Yeah. In my experience, often congregations are committed to their building and to attendance and to finances, and a friend of mine calls it the killer bees: buildings, budgets, and boilers, and burnout. How do you see mission? What is mission to you in the Christian context?
I think a lot about what the kingdom of God means. That's just how I understand Christianity. Is my job is to expand the kingdom of God. And what does that mean? There was like a little pushback online a couple years ago because some politician used the word kingdom of God, and a lot of people who didn't grow up in the church got really scared. Like they're trying to take over America with this kingdom. That's not how I see it. What I see in the kingdom of God is peace and love and reconciliation and an end to poverty and an end to hunger and an end to illness, that we take care of each other, that we try to make the world a little less awful for people who have struggled their entire lives, where we look at the marginalized, we look at the oppressed, we look at the people on the fringes of society and say, no, you belong here, that you're part of us. I think that's the role of the church. It's to constantly call us to be better versions of ourselves, right? To be more like Jesus and less like ourselves. I think we all need to come to Jesus talk in our lives, because it's easy to slip into laziness and passivity and selfishness. We need, on a regular basis, someone to get up in our face and say, you're not doing enough. You're not being enough. You're not giving enough and loving enough and serving enough. I think that's the role of the church, is to remind us on a weekly basis that we could do better. The kingdom of God could be bigger. This world could be a little less awful if we would just choose it to be that way.
I think historically in the Western church, anyway, if you go back a couple hundred years, mission was the notion that we bring God to places where God is not. And if you think about that, think of the arrogance of that, when in fact God is working everywhere. And then it sort of has evolved to the notion that we will do for others. Mission is doing for others, and sometimes we have to do for others. They don't have a place to live, find them a place to live. If they don't have anything to eat, we need to find a place to eat. But doing for ends up often just reinforcing the gap between those who have and those who don't. And so being with, I think, is a missional endeavor, and joining God where God is already working. And do you see that? Do you see that happening in some sectors of the wide spectrum of religious, particularly Christian religious practice?
I think that younger people are not going to be theologically convinced about the existence of God. There's a great theologian named Philip Yancey. He wrote this line that I use a lot, which is that no one became a Christian because they lost the argument. And I think that's so incredibly true. We try to intellectually convince people of the reality of Jesus Christ and the divinity of Jesus Christ. And I don't think that's ever been effective, even in my own life. I'll be honest with you.
Yeah.
The more I read about this, sometimes the less I believe all these things. But I can tell you this without a shadow of a doubt. When I believe the most is when I'm serving the people of God, when I'm doing the work of the kingdom, when I'm feeding kids, when I'm clothing people, when I'm, doing a home visit or doing a funeral. That is where we find God. And I think the problem is, for a lot of people, their faith is a thinking faith, not a doing faith. Orthodoxy is important. Don't get me wrong. We need orthodoxy. But it has to be coupled with orthopraxy, which is right action. If your faith does not motivate you to make the world a better place, then you don't have a faith at all, at least not a faith that I understand. People would rather spend $100 on new theology books than spend $100 on helping the poor. And I think we've got to reorient ourselves to the idea that in the United States of America, the government is not going to get much bigger. We're not Norway. We're not Sweden. We're not Denmark, right? We're not going to have this huge social safety net. And if we don't have that, and the number of churches in America is declining, because it is declining, there's more and more people that are going to fall through the cracks of the social safety net. The holes are going to get wider. And who is it going to be? The young, the orphan, the widow, the addicted, the depressed, the lonely, the people who Jesus was most focused on in his life. And so we've got to find ways to step up and be the church and close that social safety net by how we behave, how we treat those around us. It's really hard to hate a church that feeds hungry kids. That's what I've realized. It's really easy to hate a church that goes to abortion protests and rallies. We've got to become a church that does good things, and therefore no one can stand up and say, no, the church is bad. No, my church is not bad. My church is actually very good. I can tell you why, and you'll agree with me. We need more of that.
Your research also shows that 2/3 of white evangelicals don't own a gun, yet are fiercely supportive of the Second Amendment. How do you unpack that?
Guns are an interesting thing in American life because to use a term from Durkheim, they've become a totem for something bigger than that. They've become an emblem of I'm conservative, I'm Republican. It's just part of the American ethos. And I think that's something like whenever you hear like someone from Europe do a commentary on American culture about guns, it's like you can't understand American gun culture because it's just so incredibly different than what the rest of the world does. I think for a lot of people, it's like, no, I don't have one, but you should have the right to have one because it stands for conservative values. For a lot of people, it stands up to a tyrannical government, right? Like I should be able to overthrow my government if it becomes tyrannical. I at some level, I do understand that, but I also understand that the gun lobby in America actually has a huge outsized influence on gun policy in this country. For instance, almost 90% of Americans are in favor of background checks for all gun sales in this country, and yet that's not the law of the land. So there's this huge disconnect for what the people want versus what we actually get legislatively. And I think largely that's due to the gun lobby being so incredibly effective at writing letters and making phone calls and showing up at congressman's office and rallies and things like that. So if you want your voice to be heard, you got to show up and be counted. And I think a lot of people on guns are like, like they're just not motivated by it either way. The people who are motivated are like guys like the NRA And so they're the
Yeah.
ones who are guiding the conversation when really the average American is not where we are or when it comes to gun policy.
After the 2012 shooting in Sandy Hook in Connecticut, I helped form a group called Bishops United Against Gun Violence. And I've been working in the gun violence prevention space ever since. And what I've learned in this journey is that I and most people on the gun violence prevention side carry a level of arrogance and self-righteousness that just causes the other side to double down. So there's very little opportunity for real dialogue, for mutual understanding, for a way to find common ground. That said, we've discovered that the whole issue of suicide by gun is one area where both sides seem to have a common commitment. Can we reduce gun violence of suicide? Because over half of gun deaths are suicide. Where I live in New Hampshire, it's 80% gun deaths are by suicide. So
I do think the idea of just seeing the humanity in the other person is so incredibly important in these debates too. We dehumanize people oftentimes and think the worst of them.
yeah,
And oftentimes they're not that much different than you. They just hold a different opinion than you do. The Greeks believed that when you went into a debate, you were actually giving your opponent a gift by giving them the best argument, the best version of your story. We don't argue that way anymore. We argue to do a gotcha or say how stupid you are, make fun of you. But I think really good debate is when you leave and you feel like I learned something from the other side. I understand their argument in a way that I did not understand it before we started this debate. We just don't engage in that kind of discourse in America anymore. I think it makes us hate each other, honestly, because we don't see the humanity in the other.
As you're talking about that, it calls to mind a book that was written a couple of generations ago by H. Richard Niebuhr called Christ and Culture, and identified three kind of strata in our culture: Christ against culture and Christ of culture. And I think the more conservative religious people would say that see ourselves over against culture and accuse the more progressive or mainline congregations of being Christ of culture. How do you see that fault line between the two working and evolving, and where do you see it heading?
We've got to make this point that evangelicalism is actually done very well because it has an interesting relationship with the culture around it. So there's this book written by Christian Smith about 20 years ago called Evangelicals Embattled and Thriving, which I think perfectly encapsulates how they understood culture, which is, for a long time, the evangelical ethos was, let's cloister ourselves in these little enclaves over here. And if you guys want to go to hell over there, then, that's on you. We're going to focus on piety in our circles. But then in the 70s and 80s, they began to open themselves up to the larger culture. And I think that was incredibly important for two reasons. One, because it actually gave them the opportunity to evangelize people and try to bring them into the fold. But the other was, it gave them constant reminders of how they live separately than the world around them. And I think every culture needs that. They need to bump up against the differences in the world. And, the big critique of the mainline for a long time is they don't look that much different than the world. Culturally, socially, economically, educationally, they really don't stand apart. And one of the reasons they're declining is because they can't tell a compelling message about how joining this church is going to separate you from the rest of the world. It's basically country club with hymns, is what one guy told me one time. And I'm like, well, in some cases, that's probably right. I think that's always been the problem with religion, is difficult religion in America is actually doing very well even today. We're seeing Orthodox Christianity grow very rapidly. We're seeing traditional Catholicism, which is wear a veil, have a Latin mass, 2.5 hours on Sunday. That's what's doing well. Easy religion is not going to survive. It's the difficult religion that sort of separates itself from the larger culture that has been the most successful and probably will continue to be the most successful.
Well, as you're saying that, though, I'm just thinking about more and more people from your research and what I've seen and heard is that religious churches reinforce, or some congregations reinforce, my political beliefs, that it's more about my political beliefs than it is about my faith. So they're sort of aligned with the culture that surrounds them.
And I think for someone who, I grew up in the Midwest, the rural Midwest, I've been here my entire life. For people to understand this, the county I grew up in was Marion County, Illinois. It's about 30,000 people in rural central Illinois. My first election was 2000, Bush v. Gore. Bush got 51%, Gore got 48%, so very purple county. And if you go to my county today, the county where I grew up in, it's 75% Trump, if not more. Things have changed in rural America very quickly. And I think the problem is that the The church it lives downstream of that. It doesn't affect culture. It lives downstream of culture. And it just is on the receiving end of the larger political shift in America, where a lot of these places, like the places I grew up in, have become incredibly conservative. There's really, in the county that I live in right now, there are 2 churches I would say that are left of center politically. And one of them has 10 people on an average Sunday. There is no future in play. And that's what I actually worry about. My bigger worry is, let's say a kid grows up and wants to be a Christian, but is left of center politically and theologically. If you live in rural America, you've got no place to express that faith and find other people of like-mindedness to grow in a community of faith. So you're going to choose to be non-religious by default because you have no other options.
So you mentioned that your congregation closed down at the end of July and you're searching around for another religious community. What are you looking for? What will keep you coming?
Oh, that's a great question, Mark. What I really want to be a part of is a religiously diverse space where I can sit next to Republicans and Democrats on a Sunday morning, where I can hear some theology that I really agree with and some that I don't really agree with. I want it to be liturgical. I love the liturgy. I love using the lectionary. I love the creed. I love the Lord's Prayer. But I also want it to be a space where it's not, left or right. And unfortunately, in a place that I live in, you can check some of those boxes, but you can't check all those boxes. I ran a church for almost 18 years, and I've been part of ministry since I was 20 years old. I'm 42 now. I want a church where they don't ask me to do anything for a while, at least, where I can just come and sit in the back. You know what I mean? I can say the prayers, I can sing the songs, I can listen to the sermon, I can shake a few hands on the way out and be social, but they don't ask me to serve on the finance committee or preach every Sunday or, run that organization or that thing. I don't have the desire to do that right now. Mm-hmm. And so part of it is I don't want to enmesh myself too much in any community, because as soon as I do, they're going to try to scoop me up and put me in all these boards and committees, which I really don't want to do at this stage of my life. So I really don't know where I'm going to end up. I will end up in a space, I can tell you that, because I know the value of religion, both spiritually and socially. And sure. I'd be the biggest hypocrite in the world if I preached the gospel of you should go to church, it's good for you, and then I didn't go to church. So I'm going to go. I just don't know if it'll be consistently in one place.
Yeah, I when I was served as a bishop, people would always ask me, how do we get more members in the church? And I said, well, that's the wrong question. The question you need to ask is, what is God calling you to do and to be? And it sounds like that's what you're looking for, is a congregation that's engaged in what it feels is its mission.
The mantra I had the last 5 years of my ministry was, God calls you to faithfulness, not success. And I felt like I was a hospice pastor near the end. Churches like mine needed pastors to lead them. Was it fun? No. It's way cooler to be part of a congregation where you come next Sunday and there's 5 more people and 7 more people and 10 more people every Sunday. It's not fun where you go, well, who died last week? Who are we going to lose in the next 3 years, 2 years, 1 year? People like that need a pastor. They need someone in their lives. And that was my lot in life. That's the portion that God gave me. The book of Job says, the Lord give, the Lord take away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. You're supposed to do what God called you to do, even if it does not lead to what we would call success on this earth. That's it. And I can lay my head on my pillow at night and go, I did my best for as long as I could to maintain that congregation, and we stopped at the right time.
As you see this difference within the Christian community, which I've seen through my whole ordained life, which is moving on to 46 years, how do you see, or what suggestions do you have to bridge these what seem to be polarities of religious expression within the Christian faith? Yeah. How best to do that?
I think it's becoming harder and harder every year. I'll just say that. One thing I tell people is that evangelicals got to stop calling the mainline non-Christians or pagans or secular people, because they're not as religious as you are. I would ask them, do you think the world's better if we had 25% really committed conservative evangelicals and 75% nuns? Or if it was 25% evangelicals, 25% mainline, and 50% nuns? Because you're careening towards that option where it's just all nuns and all evangelicals. That's what the future looks like. I don't think that's good for democracy. I don't think it's good for society. I don't think it's good personally for people. Understand and see that just because we don't agree with each other doesn't mean we're non-Christians. And by the way, mainliners got to stop calling evangelicals fascists and bigots too.
Absolutely.
That is not helpful to the conversation. Like when I give talks about religion and politics, I go, well, what are some solutions? I go, well, first off, we should stop calling each other fascist and baby killers. Like that is not a productive way forward to move in a dialogue. And so I think we got to stop name calling and realize that, listen, most people are actually a lot more moderate than you think they are. most people really don't hold to extreme views on almost anything, and find the center, find the thing that holds us together. And what I tell people is simply this: if you affirm the Apostles' Creed, then we're on the same team. I don't care what you care about, predestination and infant baptism and abortion or whatever else. If you affirm that, then we play for the same team and believe in the same faith. And that's all we need. Everything else is commentary.
Well, and we claim Jesus, and of course, we claim Jesus in different ways. In my experience, in hearing someone else and their relationship with Jesus, which may be different than mine, deepens my relationship with Jesus. As I hear other people's faith journeys, and which may have a different trajectory than the one that I've been on, that just opens my heart and mind and my spirit a lot, much more.
Oh, I will tell you, I'm not Catholic. My wife's Catholic. I go to Mass with her. I learn something at Mass every time I go. It's a different expression of the same faith, right? The reverence they have, the order and the ritual they have. Let's celebrate the mystery of faith. I love that phrase. Like I meditate on that phrase. Like you can find something that will edify your faith in every religious space out there if you're looking for it, if you're willing to expose yourself to a different expression of the Christianity that you profess. It's okay to be uncomfortable sometimes. And actually, my goal in life has always been to walk into any religious space and feel comfortable, because I think that's saying that I'm firm in my faith. I'm confident in what I believe enough that I can walk into your situation and it won't change me. It won't make me believe less. It actually might make me believe more in some ways. When I was in college, we had this trip to Chicago where we went to a mosque and a synagogue and a Catholic church and Episcopal church and all these different expressions of faith, a Baha'i temple. That changed me forever, because it made me realize that we're all struggling to answer the same questions. Why are we here? Why is there sin? Why is there pain? Is there a God? What's after this life? We're all moving in that same direction, and we see the humanity in that, and everyone's really walking on the same journey. Man, it changes us from adversarial to friendship, right? Yeah. To warmth and wanting to seek the goodness in the other.
Well, and as you're speaking about that, this is my last question, is where do you see hope? Where is the hope emerging for you? Not just in your own life, but as you look at the landscape of religion around the country.
Oh, I think the world, if people ask me, like, when would you want to be born? My answer is right now. This is the most beautiful time to be born in the history of our country. If you look at us technologically, like, we can do this right now. We can do this podcast. You can go on the internet right now and find the answer to almost any question you want. You can talk to someone across the globe at any moment. We can get on a plane and I can be across the country in just a couple of hours. If I get cancer, I'm much less likely to die today than at any point in human history. Like, we live in a beautiful world. This is a wonderful place to be in. Do we have problems? Yes. But are they insurmountable? Absolutely not. We survived the Civil War. We survived the Great Depression. We survived 9/11. We survived all of these things. We will survive this. It will be fine. I believe in the goodness of humanity. I believe in the trustworthiness of institutions. And I believe that the future of America is brighter than the past. I just have to believe that.
It inspires what you just described, all these technological advances, gives an opportunity for creativity, drawing on the traditions from which we each come and building on that and seeking the grace and the wisdom of the Spirit, which I think infuses every religious tradition.
My career would not be where it is if it wasn't for the technology available to me. And I can't be mad about that. You know what I mean? I cannot be mad that I was born in the space that I was in at the time that I was in with the opportunities that I was given. When I get to the end of my life, I want to go to God and say, I gave it all. Got nothing left in the tank. I gave you every gift that you gave to me. I gave back to us and to the community. I think that's the goal, right? Is to give away everything that we've got. If we do that, we can end our journey well and feel good about what we did on this earth.
That's a great closing. Ryan, I want to thank you for your wisdom, your passion, and what it is that you're doing, because it needs to be done and you're doing it with energy, passion, and skill. And we're learning about the challenges and stresses that certainly the Christian church is facing, but the opportunities that I think are emerging out of that. So I want to thank you for this time and to ask you, how do people find you? Where can they connect with the writing and the speaking that you're doing?
So my personal website is ryanburge.net. You can find me there. On Twitter, I'm at Ryan Burge. My Substack is called Graphs About Religion, so charts and graphs about religion.com. You can sign up for a free subscription. I write twice a week. You can also become a paid subscriber if you'd like, and you get a little bit more content, but most of it's free. I have a couple books out. The Nuns, second edition, came out last year. I had a book called The Great Dechurching with Michael Graham and Jim Davis. It came out last year. I've got a book with Oxford coming out next year called The American Religious Landscape, Facts, Trends, and the Future. And I'm working on a book for Brazos right now called The Big Church Sort, which is about religious polarization and the impact it's having on American society and American democracy.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this time, Ryan. Blessings to you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Reconciliation Roundtable. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform and visit markbeckwith.net to stay up to date with new episodes, blog content, and other news. Please, if you could, rate and review this podcast on iTunes. It helps new listeners to find us.